Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. With me today, I have an extraordinary panel. I don't know how often you get the chance to actually hear from some of the biggest and most impactful funds in the world of how they are envisioning the future. When you look about 2023, I think most of us can agree on that has been a tough year. Is 2024 going to be more of the same, or is things changing? Do you think the biggest funds in the world, are they optimistic or slightly not so positive? We will make a lot of room today for questions, so hopefully you have your questions ready. With me today, I have Julia, and Kainz, she's a partner of Lightspeed Ventures. I have Gil Dibner, he's general partner at Angular Ventures, focused on Israel and Europe. I have Robson, partner at Sequoia, and he is mostly looking at worldwide, but you also focus on US quite a deal. Vishal, co-founder of Obvious Ventures, San Francisco. Is this good? Okay, good. So there's no doubt that you guys are well-known, well-respected, and in some regard even feared by other investors and startups. Oh, that's true. So I'm thinking to just make yourself a little bit more relatable and maybe, try to understand who you are as people better. I have a question for you. What's not on your CV? Julia, why don't you begin?
I think what's sometimes surprising to people is that deep down inside, I'm a real hippie. Oh. So I love to go on my holidays in a camper van with my surfboard, in a tent, away from sort of the glamorous hotel jet setting life, really back to nature and kind of, back to the roots.
So you're kind of secretly a Burning Man person, right? Is that what
I think that's a very different type of hippie.
Okay, so you're more the surf...
More the one that actually takes a tent and sits on the ground.
The beach surf babe. Yeah. Good, okay. Gil, what's not on your resume?
Two things. In a previous life, when I was in university, I worked on an oil tanker for 2 summers, which was kind of fun. Nice. And my dad made me do that, or suggested that I do that. I was kind of excited about it. And then since then, nothing felt like work, because I know what real work is, and that was so everything else has been easy. And now I'm involved in a lot of pro-democracy stuff in Israel, which is really important to me.
Of course, and thank you for that. George, what's not on your resume?
Learning languages is something that I think is important, especially as a Brit. Very few people make an effort to do that. So learning Spanish, I moved to Cuba for 9 months.
Whoa.
Good way to solve the problem.
And you also played chess, I know, right?
Played a lot of chess. Yeah,
a lot of chess, a lot of it.
Yeah.
Vishal, what's not on your resume?
First of all, I'm coming from San Francisco, and what is not in my resume is, or my background here is, I love Denmark. You all are amazing. The quality of furniture, the quality of design, I'm just kind of in love with Denmark. So that's not on my resume. So,
but it should be.
So that's what's not on your CV. Okay, good. So I think to be able to look forward, we also have to understand the past. Let's take a little recap of 2023 and the past 18 months. What comes to your mind, Vishal, on how has these past 18 months been? If you could sum it up maybe in 1 or 2 or 3 bullet points.
Yeah, I think in the world of venture and entrepreneurship, what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years is because the access of cheap capital, there was a lot of distortion which happened in our space. So that's kind of one big thing has happened in the last few years. And what happened was, you were seeing seed A and B was being raised in 6 months. You were seeing growth capital in good companies were getting priced at 100, 150x. And now what we are seeing is it's coming back to normalcy. So that's kind of the big shift which is happening.
So what you're saying is we're actually going back to how it is supposed to be, the old school stage matrix, hitting those unit economics and then,
Yeah, I think in the Valley, I think one of the things which we always used to practice is stage-based investment and kind of metrics which were appropriate for that stage before kind of raising the next round. And you know, whenever you think about a North Star changing a market, you have to kind of break it down to what are the steps. You know, how do you get there? And if you try to kind of sometimes do it faster than what is possible, you get into trouble. And that's what we saw in last few years.
So short, what is the price that we pay right now for the past 18 months? What is the price we pay right now, today?
I think the price what we are paying today is, on the positive side, if you're a great company, you're raising money. So that's not an issue. If you have not hit your metrics for, say, Series C, and you've raised seed A and B, and if your internal folks are not investing, then you are in trouble. If you are a growth company and you've not hit the metrics of 150x, then there is going to be structured deals which are going to happen. If you are a weak company, I think last 18 months, you were still raising money. Now money is not there, and so you're going to be in trouble. You know, so those are kind of things which are happening. But having said all that, I'm still very optimistic. I think technology trends are there. We're going to build amazing companies, and just need to kind of go back to fundamentals.
Thank you, Vishal. George, quick recap of the past 18 months. Can you sum it up somehow? How has it been, according to you, Sequoia?
So we did a session with our founders kind of early 2022 called Adapting to Endure, where we brought all of our portfolio together, basically around this idea that like if you don't have a plan, you'll never know when you arrive at your destination. And obviously when the world changes around you, you need to adapt that plan because the constraints are different. I think the really important piece that we keep relaying is like in today's environment, you still need to be optimistic about what it is you want to achieve. We think the problem statement is the same. You want to go out and build a company that will matter, right? That will hopefully dominate an important market in the long term. That has always been difficult to do, actually. A lot of those problems are people problems, product market fit problems, finding a scalable go-to-market through these channels, et cetera, et cetera. Capital is an input into doing that. It is not the only thing that is an input into doing that. And I think that's important because what that reminds you is you can actually focus on things inside the building for the most part and just prioritizing resources, thinking about where you make areas of investment. So a lot of what we actually spent the last year and a half doing was reminding everybody, you got to go out and be optimistic, you got to go out and make a difference. At the end of the day, when you make an investment in something that has path dependency, i.e. something where it's not just an initial investment up front, but there is some implication of a continued investment in that thing, that might be around attacking a new market, building a new product line, whatever it is. In today's world, you need to do that with a higher level of conviction because the opportunity cost is now greater on you doing it because capital is maybe less plentiful, maybe less widely available, but it's still the same goal, which is build a company that will matter. And I think for founders, particularly at seed and pre-seed, that's quite an important message because you don't have a huge amount of capital to go out and do that with. Actually, that ruthless prioritization is something you've got to work really carefully on.
I know we will dive more into that of how the structure is for the next 18 months. But given Sequoia is worldwide, basically Asia, Africa, US, Europe, and so forth, is there even a slight difference between the price we pay in Europe, we pay in US, we pay in Asia and Africa, and like, or is it the same overall, global, same?
I think that the US was probably slightly earlier, or founders were slightly earlier in the US in terms of reacting to how the macro changed. I think that a lot of what happened in our portfolio was founders took quite decisive action relatively early in terms of thinking about how they reallocate budgets, reallocate headcount, things like that. I don't think pricing is the key input. I think you pay for quality, and the challenge is obviously to build a business that is high quality and is working. That challenge is the same universally. I think the main difference actually is the technology trends are playing out in slightly different ways, in slightly different geographies for a range of other factors we can talk about.
I know we will dive into that a little later on sectors and industries. Gil, if you have to summarize the past 18 months, I mean, you are focused mainly Europe, Israel.
Right.
How has the past 18 months been? Can it be summarized somehow?
Yeah, look, I think in the world that we operate in, there's really no meaningful difference between US, Europe, and Israel. They're all part of one ecosystem. As a sub-point to that, I would argue that Israel and the US are now so aligned that there was no time lag at all between what happened in Israel and what happened in the US. I think in Europe there was about a 6 to 9 month time lag where the VCs didn't realize what was happening or didn't want to admit to themselves what was happening. And most of that's just because most VCs operating in Europe have only been doing this for 2 or 3 years. But ancient people like me remember the previous slowdown, so it's a little easier. I think I agree with everything that was said. I think what might be a useful framing for people is I think we're sort of halfway through year 2 of a 3-year period, right? Where 22 was the year where the slowdown became widely acknowledged. I think a lot of people, like we started to see concrete evidence of slowdown happening in late 21. Like there were rounds being repriced, or rounds, term sheets being pulled starting in Q3 and Q4 of 21. But I think 22 was when it became obvious to everybody and undeniable that the slowdown was happening. So 22 is this kind of year of realization of figuring out what was happening. I think 23 is the year where like we started the year all knowing what was going on. Nobody finished 22 thinking everything was fine. And I think it's too early in 23 for there to be any like a significant pickup. And I think in 24 we're going to see the beginning of the recovery. And I think it's really easy to focus the conversation on venture dollars flowing down into the startups. I think it's a lot more important to focus the conversation on customer dollars flowing up into the startups. And what we saw across our portfolio, and I think you see this in public markets, and I think you see this any founder or salesperson or investor that's honest is going to tell you that for the most part, customers just slammed on the brakes in 22 and basically stopped buying stuff. And we saw a ton of resetting of forecasts and resetting of sales expectations, even for our best performing companies, to the point where I think it was David Sachs made this point on the All In Pod, and I completely agree with him. If you could just add revenue at the same pace as before, you were killing it. In other words, like if you could sell 100K a month of stuff, in 21, and you could still sell 100K of stuff in 22 or 23, amazing, because most people were selling a lot less because there was just a ton more buying resistance. And that meant that all the targets were reset, all the budgets had to get reset, the spending people were planning to do in anticipation both of customer dollars flowing in and venture dollars flowing in, that all had to be reset. So I think we're not going to see a meaningful recovery until sometime next year. And so where we are right now is
Gil, we'll take that in a second where we are, because we want to hear that in the front, right?
Sure.
Julia, when you recap 2023 and the past 18 months, what comes to mind?
Yeah. So again, I also agree with everything that has been said before, but maybe to add another point to it, I think the hard thing as a founder right now is that the market is kind of split.
Yeah.
So you still have businesses that, despite definitely pipeline slowing down, buying is slowing down, there's still businesses that are growing really, really fast because they have a good product and they have something that sticks. And, it's not that budget's completely dried up. It's just slowed down, and especially for stuff that is kind of not mission critical to a business or not really needed right now. It's more sort of additional software spend. And then you have the other side of the market, and venture dollars are still flowing into that segment. So it's also not true that I think VCs completely stopped investing. There is still activity, right? It's just very, very concentrated to this like small piece of super, super top companies versus sort of a broader ecosystem. And so given that benchmark being now even more raised of what it means to build a top company, fast growing, but still, people take a closer look at revenue composition, revenue quality, and your burn rate and so on. And so it's just become, I think George said that rightly, the goal hasn't really changed what a good company is. It just, the framework or the parameters of how to get there have tightened a bit. And I think that's where the struggle is sometimes at this point.
So speed mattered a lot past, and now it's a slight different.
But my point is, like, I think if you want to raise from a top VC, your growth rate still matters.
Yeah.
But venture investors will also take a look at the other part of the metrics, maybe more than before the market reset.
Well, let's talk about the future. 2024, the next 18 months from today and until next September. Vishal, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Let's put the crystal ball, obvious ventures. What do you think?
As I mentioned, I think there's going to be realignment back to the fundamentals, and that's what's happening in the next 18 months, which means good companies will continue to grow. which means companies who have been overcapitalized and are not able to kind of meet the targets which were expected, they are going to struggle. And there's going to be a cleanup in the system, which is very well needed, because I think what we've seen is everybody became a VC, everybody became an entrepreneur in last 4 or 5 years, and entrepreneurs are very special. They're like kind of building something from nothing and growing a company and changing the status quo is not for everybody, and we're going to kind of see going back to that reality of fundamentals. So that's what I'm thinking is going to happen in the next 18 months. There's going to be some pain, which we're going to see. Having said all that, again, there are a lot of interesting technologies. There's also huge problems in the world to be solved, and so we're going to see great entrepreneurs going after changing the status quo.
When we prepped for this session, you said, let's work on real problems, right? Your fund, Obvious Ventures, that you co-founded, you say we are a world positive fund. And when you and I talked, you said, I like to co-dream. I like to be that person that goes early. What advice would you give all those startups, early stage startups now? I mean, AI is, enlightening and creating a lot of new ventures, but it's also swiping up and out a lot of businesses who thought they had a business and overnight don't think they have a business anymore. So, any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think for us, what World Positive is kind of solving humanity's biggest challenges.
And what are those?
And if you think about humanity's biggest challenges, we categorize at Obvious around kind of 3 broad areas. One is planet health, second is human health, third is financial and work health. And in each of these areas, if you see, there's like a lot of shifts happening, whether it's oil-based mobility shifting to electric mobility. You see shifts around kind of move towards net zero. You see immigration challenges, especially in the US, aging population where blue-collar workers are hard to find and retain. So augmentation in that world. We are seeing geopolitical shifts on manufacturing between US and China, and what are the opportunities around bringing manufacturing closer to home. We see costs of healthcare really high. How do we improve outcomes in that area? We see the opposite of Moore's law in biology, where the cost of bringing drugs into the market is going exponentially high. How do we use computational approaches to fix that? So we see retirement challenges. People don't have enough money saved. So there are all these amazing problems, and then there are all these innovations, whether it's robotics or transformer technologies, or like all these kind of interesting tools in the toolkit. And how do we go and solve all these amazing problems and build a better society?
Thank you, Vishal. George, outlook for the next 18 months?
I think so. One of my partners uses this phrase a lot, that the only freedom is free cash flow, right? And it's this idea that until you have free cash flow, you've got to earn the right to exist as a business. Obvious fact. I think what is important to recognize is actually a lot of the texture, a lot of the conversations in our board meetings or conversations with our founders has shifted a little bit, we think, in the last quarter towards people remembering that, again, you want to build a company that will matter. And what that means is you need to take high conviction bets, high conviction areas of investment over the next 12, 18 months. Part of that is because you found these businesses to be optimistic. You found this business because you're ambitious. You spent the last year and a half regrouping a little bit with your team, making some tough decisions inside of the building. But actually now there's that level of urgency, and we see it almost unease, right, in the group, in the founding teams, to go out and keep pushing forwards. So I think that's point one. That's actually a more optimistic take, which I think is very crucial. I think outside of that, something like AI, it doesn't really give you a distribution advantage as a business. It might change the cost curve for you to be able to deliver some product or service. We're seeing that a lot in markets where they're quite human-intensive industries, often industries where there's a supply and demand mismatch for a particular type of skill set. I think when we think about that, we really love it because those are very long-term trends that will take time to play out. They are generally about empowering humans to be more productive. They might not be robots, but cobots. You might be looking at like the healthcare system and recognizing there aren't enough nurses to provide a given service, whatever it might be. But actually, it starts with that insight that there is a supply and demand mismatch, and the cost curve to provide a service needs to shift. And we love looking at problems where technology can do that. And we see a wonderful moment in time where a lot of those technologies are coming to market for the first time.
But George, let's be honest here, should we, just for a moment? Europe totally lost the race on AI, right?
What's that?
Europe totally lost the race
No, of course
on AI.
not.
No.
I think so. I mean, there's lots of Europe-specific nuance, which is actually still to be replicated in what you see from foundational models. We have different regulation here around GDPR, different levels of data controls. Data sovereignty is something that is very important in Europe, obviously given that regulation, that is not fully reflected in the current status quo. We have a wonderful developer open source infrastructure and culture here. And if you think about a lot of the tooling, a lot of the middleware around ML ops, Europe has as good a shot as anywhere to start to build those applications. So yeah, we remain optimistic and investing here for that reason.
So Europe is a niche market.
Europe is a market that has nuance. And you can build from here and you can go and take on the world.
I'm just kidding with you,
Yeah.
but I'm messing a little with you. Gil, come on. All the money should go to Israel. It's the most innovative location ever.
I never said that.
Facts.
No, I mean, that's clearly not true. I mean, the whole thesis of our fund is that geography doesn't really matter that much. So we think there's great. I mean, I just wrote the biggest first check of my life into Denmark. We can't talk about it.
Whoa, the first big
So-
check ever to Denmark?
No, the biggest check of my life. The biggest first check
went
of
to
my life.
Denmark. Can we get an applause? Seriously?
But and I think the interesting thing is that company has they have revenue, they have cash flow, they have real customers. They don't actually need my money to survive. They need my money to grow, and there's no chance that they run out of money. That's not possible, right? So I think the only question is that company worth 50 billion or 5 million, right? Or, that's kind of the question, but it's worth something, right? Sorry, I meant 50 million or 5 billion, right? Is it a success but not enormous, or can it be enormous, right? But they're not it can't be zero, right? And I think that kind of brings me to the thing I wanted to say, which was I think like in the conversation between VCs, right? Part of that conversation is, okay, VCs are looking at new investments and what do we want to see and what do we want to invest in, and that's a universe where VCs are selecting, in our case, roughly 1 in 1,000 companies that we meet, we do, right? But I think that's not a super helpful framing for a founder you're already in one company. You can't just switch horses midway, right? And I think so for us as people who are in the business of, we have two halves of our business. Half of the business is selecting new investments, right? And then we're adjusting to what trends we think are interesting, or, how much revenue or traction we want to see at a particular time or whatever. But the other half of our business is working with companies that we're in, and we're committed to them, and we're committed to them forever, right? Basically. And as a founder, you're in the company that you're already in. And I think from that perspective, the question is, okay, given what's going on in the environment, what do I do now? And I think we've made a change, and I think a lot of founders have made a change, was to adjust back into this ecosystem or to the environment that we're in. And yes, we aspire that Sequoia and Lightspeed and Obvious are going to come and lead our next rounds in our companies and like invest money and take things to greatness, right? But what we've changed is we're no longer. We just do not assume that's going to happen. We assume that is not going to happen, right? So we underwrite. We do not underwrite to the idea, which a lot of people were doing in 21. They were underwriting an investment, and founders were underwriting their activity to the idea that if I do a certain set of things, I'll be in a position to tell a narrative to another investor who will mark me up and give me more money. We are not doing that anymore at all, and we're not advising people to do it. What we're doing is we're underwriting to break even, which used to be a dirty word, and I have no problem with that at all, because like you said, free cash flow is you live to fight another day, you control your destiny, you can have M&A conversations without any time pressure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or we underwrite to the company will achieve enough success or milestones or traction or whatever that we ourselves will be comfortable putting more money in regardless of anybody else. And that's a conversation that we have with our founders all the time, and that's, I think that's a much more helpful framing than like, how do I play the venture game? Because those rules have shifted so much that it's not safe to plan on another round.
Gil, before I give the word to Julia, when we had the prep call, you shared with us an article on how startups should now communicate differently with the investors. Can you say a few words short about that? It's not about runway cash burn necessarily only, but it's also about strategy.
I mean, I think so the article that you're referencing is an article by Hunter Walk where he's talking about, should startups communicate their cash runway in their updates and emphasize those kind of metrics? My view is strongly yes, and his view is no. And I think that I don't think we actually disagree with each other. I think we're just emphasizing different things, right? What he's saying is, unless you have, and they're both true, right? Unless you have a narrative that supports the idea that you're going to become a super interesting company, there's probably no point in doing this. And that's largely true, at least from a venture capital point of view, although there's a caveat to that. And the other side of the argument is, your narrative can be fantastic, but if you can't live long enough to build something and get there, the narrative is irrelevant because you're dead, right? So I think both of those things are true. I think the caveat is, I had dinner with a founder last night here that's not in our portfolio. I'd never met him before. And he's like, okay, we're doing X. And he talks to me for 5 minutes about X. And then he goes, we're not really doing X anymore, we're doing Y. And Y is not really that scalable, and it has much lower margins than X, but it's working, and I'm selling it, and I can build an actual business here. And I say to him, well, Y is not really a venture business. And for a while, I was like, no, it's still a good business. It's still an actual business.
It's not a fundable
business. You can still scale it. It's just going to be really hard to find, an investor like us that's going to want to back that for a whole bunch of reasons that don't matter to you, because you're not in the business of selling your equity to me. You're in the business of building a company that sells a service to customers. And that's a mental shift that has to happen.
Absolutely.
I think we were so obsessed with the venture game, and founders were obsessed with that game, that they stopped focusing on what they were actually doing, which is supposed to be delivering value to customers. And if you can deliver value to customers at slightly slower growth and slightly lower margins, but you can survive, that's legitimate.
Thank you, Gil. Julia, quick point of the future before we take questions. Let's talk about sectors, what sectors are going to do very well, and what do you think is going to be the narrative for the next 18 months?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. I think right now there's probably two themes, if you want to say so, for oversimplification that we see a lot of money flowing into.
And that is?
One is the whole, obviously, big elephant in the room, everything that has generative AI crashed on it. Mm-hmm. I think how we look at that ecosystem is sort of three different layers. One is the model layer, and sort of the belief being that there's going to be more than one foundational model in the market. The second is sort of the enablement layer on top. Today, enterprises still find it quite hard, actually, to adopt LLMs and related technology just because there's no infrastructure around it, security-wise. I think about observability, all of that stuff. And then the last part is sort of the application layer, which is also where I, by the way, spend a lot of my time together sort of with the second layer. I think that's still going to see a lot of the next couple of months flowing in. One area I'm particularly interested in is sort of a new rebirth of vertical SaaS. Vertical SaaS has been sort of over the last... It's always been, for me, historically, a bit of a tricky sector because, vertical SaaS has the characteristics to be quite sticky. It's very targeted in terms of workflows, very specific to your user and your customer. And so it's usually quite easy to get a lot of market share. But historically, the budget's been quite small in that segment.
Exactly.
And so that's changing right now. It's partly because just pressing consumer interest. It's partly because maturity of certain segments. And then also sort of that shift with everything that I just mentioned about generative AI is kind of changing what it means to have an interesting business, right? There's a unique data advantage. There's a unique workflow advantage. And so actually we're spending a lot of time thinking about industries that historically, again, have been super pen and paper, very slow to adapt, because I think the game is changing there a little bit.
You also talked about defense tech, semiconductors, space, and quantum computing. And what are your thoughts on that?
So I think that's the second part. In Europe, historically, those segments haven't been very strong in terms of a lot of companies being funded and founded, especially sort of with a view on the venture landscape. And I think that's changing a little bit as well. We see more and more pitches or companies coming to us with and getting funding amazingly, building really interesting businesses in defense, in semiconductors, in aerospace, in biotech.
But these industries needs a lot of capital, Julia.
It does,
a lot of money.
And I think that's the point. In Europe, you never really had enough market to then support that journey and kind of warrant that capital investment from a VC perspective. But because there's sort of a a little bit of a geopolitical shift happening and different parts of the world trying to be more sovereign, I think that's changing a little bit as well. And so yeah, we definitely see more activity there as well.
So we still have another four minutes. I would like to take a question, and we already have 3 questions. So I'm going to read 3 questions, and then we can just quickly answer them. Do you think there's a funding gap for startups that are able to grow with their own cash flow, that can scale but are not venture cases, or will VC fill in? I think you addressed that a little bit, Gil, maybe. Want to say a few words about that one?
I don't think there's a funding gap for anything. I mean, I think especially if you're cash flow generative, then by definition, there's no funding gap. So I'm not sure I understand the question, but there are investors who will fund profitable scaling businesses.
Good, thank you. Can you address the AI and the fall of moats? Moats, yeah.
I'd love to talk about this for a second. I think what's unique about this moment in AI in my mind, and this came from one of the smartest AI people I know. I sort of asked him about these, what's your take on this? He was like, what makes this moment unique in history of technology is that everybody's having the same insight at exactly the same time. In other words, the AI thing has been so obvious, it's been so overwhelmingly incredible. Everyone was surprised by the power of these generative models that everyone, from the smartest practitioners to the most uninformed person, were equally surprised, roughly, by the capabilities. And so the founders and technologists are all struggling with the same set of challenges and opportunities at the same time. The result of that is that we've seen in the past 3 months probably 20 companies that are doing how does an enterprise deploy an LLM, 20 companies are doing security for these things, 20 companies are doing prompt chaining, and I think the smartest people that I know are actually sitting back and waiting to see how the dust settles.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I add something to that? I think there's also, and I discussed it a lot with one of our CEOs, actually, the CEO of Typeface, because he used to be a long-time executive at Adobe, Oracle, Microsoft, and then founded a couple of businesses as well. He's seen both sides of both incumbents and startups. And there's an interesting shift a little bit also with that whole ecosystem of the sort of the dynamic between actually large incumbents and startups, right? It used to be always that being the most nimble, the fastest to move in a space was the number one thing that mattered.
And
I think now sort of, again, access to unique data, amounts of data, distribution power suddenly matter a lot more again as well. And we've seen that companies really in the early stages shift their strategy, trying to partner up with large corporates, changing sort of how they think about hiring and all of that stuff to kind of adapt to that strategy.
I believe you told me last night that the power balance, because of AI, is now changing. It used to be small startups had a lot of power towards the big ones because they were not innovative. But that's changing, right, Julia?
I think it's just the go-to-market for some of the early companies and access to data has changed a little bit, and having to reshift how you think about partnering with those large corporations that have access, and baking that much earlier into a strategy than maybe later on.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. We have another 1 minute, maybe 1 minute and 20 seconds, if I can buy extra 20 seconds. George, are valuation going to be lower?
I think it's about your context window. I think remembering that there was a little bit of craziness over the last few years where some of those valuations were inflated. There will, of course, be a correction from that. You see it reflected in the public markets. It is already feeding through not just to kind of growth stage rounds, but to early rounds and seed rounds. But again, it's about remembering that at that point, it's about bringing on the right partner, having enough capital to be ambitious, hiring the right team, building a product that customers like, all of these things that are important. The valuation is an important input, but it's not the only input at that stage.
Okay. Vishal, Gil, you have children. Will you encourage them to go out and start a startup in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Well, she's 6.
She's 6. Oh, she can do it. Yeah,
No.
No. Vishal, you have a son, right? Do you want him to start a company?
Yeah, no, I think my son is 21 years of age, and I think what I'm seeing, this amazing thing in this next generation, that they are pursuing their education, but they also have a side hustle. So he already has a SaaS business and has clients which pays him while he's going to college. So I think this next generation, I'm very hopeful, is going to come build amazing companies and solve biggest problems.
But can we agree on optimistic for the next 18 months? Optimistic?
I think I'm optimistic over next 10, 15, 20 years. 18 months, there's going to be pain.
George, optimistic?
Cautiously.
Gil, optimistic?
Sales is king. If you can sell, I'm very optimistic. If you can't sell, you're screwed.
Julia, optimistic?
Yeah, agree.
Let's give our panel a big hand, shall we?
Thanks, team.